Hey,
Woo woo.
woo woo.
Woo
Okay.
woo. Woo
Yeah.
woo.
All right.
Calling Chris Anderson in Windsor.
This is Chris Anderson in Windsor and calling Rick Byer. You look like you're still in Chicago.
I'm in Chicago, and look at that new mic you have.
Isn't that? Yeah.
You sound good. You look good.
Does
It
it?
looks very professional.
Does
You should do this for a living
it? Yeah.
if you
So
don't want to
far.
make much money. Uh,
uh,
Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at
well,
StephenAmbroseTours.com.
wait a minute. You've
What?
got new headphones, or do you have
Did you,
old headphones that?
it's the same old headphones.
No, you used to have like big, like poofy ones.
I hardly ever wear those.
Sorry.
Did you just wake up from a long sleep?
It's the time zone difference. It's the time difference.
Okay, I know you're about to hit the road for mega travel, but you just have to keep your grip on reality for the
All right,
moment.
I'm holding on tight here.
Anyway, check out the rich offering of history tours at StephenAmbroseTours.com. And Chris, I'm going to let you do this. Whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH
Podcast.
Oh, nice. We are glad you're here. And today we'll be talking about the 32nd Division in the Pacific. Let us know that you're here. Let us know what you're drinking. That's, of course, very important. And Chris, we should thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons. I don't know if you noticed, but we have
I've noticed. Look at that. It's all filled in down the bottom there.
We have a new top shelf patron there. Dave Borland is there. Dave, if you are watching right now and you want a hat, you need to send me your address so I can send you a hat as a top shelf patron. I know I have your address someplace because you live up here in the Chicago area, but don't make me look for it. If you want a hat, send me your address. And if you want a hat or you just want to be a top shelf patron, patreon.com/History Happy Hour.
We're going to change the font size soon.
I know. Or go to page 2 or something. I don't know. Maybe we should have a higher level. The ceiling patron. I don't know. Chris, who's out there?
Yeah, well, Kim from Wisconsin and R.J. Griscom from San Diego. Dave Borland has joined us from Evanston.
Hey, Dave, make sure you let us know if you want a hat.
And Tony Coulter's back, so it's good to see Tony again. Barry Milgate from the UK. And yes, you're right, Barry. It has been sunny here in the UK, and it's been wonderful to see that strange thing called the sun. And so, welcome.
Okay. And lots of other people. So thank you all for joining us. And Chris, give us a cue. Let's get going.
All right. The bar is open.
Yeah, bar's open. What's on tap?
Yeah, so you'd mentioned the 32nd Division. So we're joined this week by Mark Van Ellis. He is a professor of history at Queensborough Community College of the City University of New York, but he is a native of Wisconsin. He is the author of To Hear Only Thunder Again, America's World War II Veterans Come Home.
Whoa. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Yes, sorry. Go ahead. Bad headphones. Go ahead.
You need new headphones. And America and World War I, A Traveler's Guide. But we're here this week to talk with him about his new book, Red Arrow Across the Pacific, the 32nd Infantry Division during World War II. So there we go.
Mark Van Ells, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Sorry for interrupting Chris when he's mentioning your earlier book title. I had a little brain spasm.
Now he's brain farting, yeah.
But I just want to say, did you bring a cocktail, Mark?
Did you bring a cocktail?
Sure did. You bet.
What'd you bring?
I probably thought about this a little too much, to be honest. As you noted, I'm a Wisconsin native, so I originally thought beer. Yeah. But then I thought this program goes on for about an hour, and I thought maybe it might be difficult to get to the end. So I decided to have some scotch instead.
What kind of scotch, Mark?
I've got some Lefroy.
Oh, you are a man of taste and refinement, sir.
From Lefroy, Wisconsin.
And there is a 32nd Division connection to the Lefroy too.
Is there?
It's from the Isle of Isla. as
Yeah.
Scotch lovers know.
Yeah.
And during the First World War, a troop ship called the Tuscania was torpedoed by a U-boat right off the coast. And among some of the soldiers on that ship were members of the 32nd
Really?
Division. And
Ah.
there's a monument there now overlooking
Yeah.
the ocean, and it's really, really quite beautiful. And I kind of got hooked on the Lefroy when I was there. So there's a bit of a 32nd Division connection.
Cool. Well, Lefroy is good, but I have Glen Turret 12, so that's my Scotch.
I'm drinking a beer. I should have brought a Leinenkugel to honor Wisconsin, but this is a Bell's Two-Hearted IPA. So,
or maybe an old style or something.
Oh yes. So I could have gone with Ham's, more of a Minneapolis connection. But anyway, Chris, go for it.
All right. Well, okay. Mark, in the introduction to your book, you say that aside from the fact that the division deserves a history, in part because it's not that well known and people haven't talked about it, but you also say, in part because its history encompasses the entirety of the United States involvement in World War II. What do you mean by that? And kind of, was that what drew you to the topic?
Well, what drew me to the topic was the fact that I was born and raised in Wisconsin, and like a lot of people in Wisconsin, the 32nd Division is, and its sort of successor organization, it's really part of communities all across the state. That red arrow emblem is seen, you see it in parks, and there's a memorial highway and these sorts of things. So it was really, it's part of Wisconsin life. And not much had been written about it. So that was the main reason that I decided to write about this topic. And I thought it was something that was missing from the narrative of the Pacific War. What I mean by it encompasses the entirety of the American military experience, is that it was on active duty for 6 years, basically. It was the division was called up in the fall of 1940, when the first National Guard call-up was, and when the draft began. And it remained on active duty until the end of February 1946. It had been on occupation duty in Japan. So it was on duty basically throughout the entirety of the American military experience during that conflict. And during the conflict, of course, it saw tremendous transformations from a not very well prepared National Guard division to certainly members of the division anyway thought one of the best divisions that the U.S. Army had. So as the American military became sort of nationalized and much better at what it did, the 32nd Division, its history sort of traces that experience.
That transformation. Okay.
So there's a quote that you have that appears later in the book, and it's from a literary scholar named Elizabeth Samet, and she's talking about the World War II generation. And she says, as the generation passes away, to be frozen within the pantheon of heroes, walled off from the present, larger than life, untouchable, not quite of this world, the real and deeply ambivalent legacies of the Second World War risk becoming lost forever. So what are those real and deeply ambivalent legacies, and how do we preserve them from being lost?
The World War II experience, like any other war experience, I suppose, it has many different aspects to it. In our popular culture, we oftentimes tend to focus on the valor of many soldiers. There's sort of almost sort of a hero worship, I think, with World War II veterans, and I certainly understand that. But also involved in the war experience are lots of really terrible, horrible things. Large-scale killing, including sometimes deaths of civilians, just the absolute brutality of war. And war in the Pacific was one of the most brutal parts of this entire conflict. The way that the war affected people and their health, their psyche, into the post-war years. I don't think we should think of war as always being this glorious thing. It can be that, but I think we also have to keep in mind the human, how it affects people, and all these need to be considered when we think about the war. And so I try to portray as well as I could all of these different aspects of the war experience. So yes, there was the travel, and there was the adventure, there was the satisfaction of defending the country, but there was a lot of heartache, and people's lives were sometimes broken by it. And no two people experienced the experience of war the same way either. So but it's a complicated experience that I think oftentimes gets left out of our popular understanding of conflict.
So Mark, I mean, we're going to spend most of the show talking about the World War II and the unit in the Pacific, obviously. Mm-hmm. But I think just for those of us who aren't from Wisconsin, can you tell us a little bit?
Michigan.
Or Michigan, see what I mean?
Let's not forget about Michigan.
All right, if you want me to go, I'll go on about the Yankees.
You're going to leave Michigan in, Chris.
All right. Wisconsin and Michigan. That's definitely west of Worcester. Could you tell us a little bit about the division, its roots? I know, in World War I, the French called them the Terribles. So tell us a little bit about where they're coming from, what their history is.
Sure. Well, this is traced back to the militia, that you can trace all the way back to colonial times. But the 32nd Division was created during the First World War. That's when the U.S. Army first created the permanent numbered divisions. It was a National Guard division made up of Wisconsin and Michigan soldiers. It was divisions, I think, 1 through 12 were regular Army, and then 26 through, I'm forgetting the numbers offhand, were National Guard divisions, and then the draftee division. So this was a division made up of Wisconsin and Michigan soldiers. So it went to France. It had a good reputation during the First World War. The French called it, as you noted, Les Terribles.
And you said that much better than I did.
Yeah.
My French is horrible. That's the best I can do.
But not as bad.
For their ferociousness. And it does. I know this doesn't mean they're terrible. It means they had a ferociousness to them. And they were on occupation duty in the Rhineland after the war, and then came back and were demobilized. They were not very well trained and organized through much of the post-war period. The U.S. military had sort of had lapsed during that period, and then was recalled during the Second World War.
Okay. So it's a National Guard division.
Yes.
And so it's one of the things that you kind of make clear is it's a little bit looked down on by the regular Army, and not only early in the war, but even kind of getting later on. There's the sense when MacArthur is commanding the armies in the Pacific that he's looking down on the 32nd Division. So is that just like a little cultural oddity that that's National Guard, so we kind of look down our noses at them, or does that have an actual impact on the division fighting in the theater and the sort of the way we remember the division?
Yeah, that's sort of hard to say. I mean, there has long been that tension between the regulars and the National Guard, and those on active duty oftentimes, even still today, look down at the weekend warriors, quote unquote. And there were real questions as to how well National Guard divisions were prepared. In the book, I note some of the how the training between the wars wasn't always that good. I forgot what I was going to say. Don't you hate when that happens?
That happens to me. That happens to me all the time. I was asking about the fact that they were looked down on, and did that impact them in a serious way, or was it just kind of a little cultural oddity?
I think perhaps at first, When it comes to the question of MacArthur, I mean, he's sort of famously known as an egomaniac and someone who very much wanted to grab the headlines and didn't want to look bad in the newspapers. And the 32nd Division was the first U.S. Army division sent in to fight the Japanese. The Marines, of course, had been in Guadalcanal before that, but they were the first U.S. Army division. And is oftentimes the case when it's the first time a division had been in combat, it at first didn't do that well. Was it because of the soldiers? Was it because of the training? Was it because of the leadership? There are many different ways you could certainly look at that. Now, as the war went on, as I think I mentioned earlier, the regional character of these National Guard divisions begins to change as replacements come in. These divisions are nationalized. So by 1945, let's say, it's not really a National Guard division anymore. It's a truly national division. But it does seem that MacArthur seemed to hold a grudge for whatever reason against the 32nd Division, whether or not it was because it was a National Guard division or because it was the division's initial performance at Buna or whatever it was. That sense seemed to haunt the 32nd Division throughout the war, even though at the end of the war, the Japanese noted how they thought it was the best division that they were fighting in Luzon. That reputation, for whatever reason, still held on. And I suspect you have a combination of old ideas are hard to kill sometimes, perhaps a prejudice of regular officers. It's hard to say.
So, Mark, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how it gets into the theater, because you make the point, and I know reading about it, and when I used to work for the National Guard, you want to have about a year to train a unit up before you send them off to do whatever you're going to have them do. Mm-hmm. But the 32nd goes off in lightning fashion, and you kind of get into the details. They're not supposed to at first be in the Pacific. They get there faster than anybody. Can you tell us a little about that and why they're sent so quickly?
Absolutely. Again, they were mobilized in October of 1940. They went to Beauregard and then
Louisiana.
Livingston, Louisiana. They had trained there for a while. They were part of the Louisiana maneuvers. Again, one can question the quality of their training, but they had been there for a while. Then they were originally slated to go to Europe. So in February of 1942, they packed up and they went to Fort Devens, Massachusetts. They were supposed to be among the leading edge of American troops going into Northern Ireland. Their engineers, in fact, had already made it to Northern Ireland, began to make plans and lay railroad tracks and these sorts of things. But the situation in the Pacific then becomes quite tenuous. MacArthur was told to leave the Philippines. The Philippines all but seemed doomed. It looked like Australia was about to be attacked. In fact, the northern coast was bombed. And Australia had was practically defenseless. Its regular divisions were fighting the Germans in the Mediterranean, and there was one division that was at Singapore when the Japanese came in. So Australia was Australia was in big trouble. So the 32nd Division was rushed from Massachusetts, sent on a cross-country railroad trip to San Francisco. And then from San Francisco, they had a 3-week voyage across the Pacific to Adelaide, Australia. And then once they were in Australia, they stayed in South Australia for a few months, and then they moved to a place called Camp Cable that was near Brisbane. And they were there for several months when they were then thrown into the fight against the Japanese. So this was a division that was almost constantly on the move, basically from February of 1942 up to the first leading elements went in September of 1942. So not only does it make it difficult to train a division under circumstances like this, but there are lots of questions about the kind of training that the division was getting in Australia. Jungle warfare was not something that very many Americans had much experience with. And so the training of the division, many have faulted for its initial performance at Buna.
Well, I mean, I know General Eichelberger said that none of our guys were ready for jungle warfare when we sent them into the jungles. I mean, I think.
Yeah, they were getting more of the same. Again, they were trained for war in Europe. That was what they were doing in Louisiana. They were expected to go to Europe. But again, even once they got to Australia, there were questions about whether or not they were truly prepared for it. The Camp Cable, they built themselves, and they carved it out of the scrublands in the outback of Australia. They tended to focus a lot on conditioning.
Yep.
But cover and concealment and night operations and these sorts of things did not seem to factor much into the division's training.
So they're going to go into action in New Guinea.
Yes.
And I'm going to ask you to talk about that, but I'm going to first of, this is just part of my effort to prove that I, read as much of the book as I could. So I keep trying to throw out quotes at you. But you write, soldiers and sometimes entire divisions often struggle in their first fight, but the Red Arrow's baptism was one of the most troubled and traumatic in U.S. history. So with that quote in mind, tell us what they're doing in New Guinea and what they are dealing with there.
All right.
And where is New Guinea? Because I think a lot of people don't even know where New Guinea is.
New Guinea was a really important part of the American military effort in the Pacific. But it's an island just north of Australia. It's the second largest island in the world, second only to Greenland. And it's an island that was largely covered with mountains and jungle. It was not independent. Basically the Dutch and then later the Japanese controlled the eastern half. The Australians controlled the western half. It was a colonial economy. Big Western companies grew coconuts and other sorts of things in plantations along the coast. It was an island that had very few roads. I think one railroad was on the entire island. So it was not very economically developed, and by Western standards, and didn't really have much of an infrastructure at all. But Australia was really important, either for launching any kind of attacks on Australia. Japan wasn't seriously considering invading Australia, but they could certainly harass Australia. They could harass the shipping lanes and those sorts of things. So for the Japanese, this was a very important place to occupy in order to check Australia. And for the Australians, this was a very important place for their defense. It was almost like a shield that they could use to prevent the Japanese from menacing their coastlines. There were small numbers of Australian troops there. The Japanese recognized the significance of Australia. And in the summer of 1942, they invade the northern part of the Papuan Peninsula. That's the far southeastern part of New Guinea. And also the far eastern tip of New Guinea as well, at a place called Milne Bay becomes a place where there's a fairly substantial fight that takes place just before Buna does. And so the Australians had to rush troops in there. The Japanese were on the north side of the island. They begin to move southward over the mountains. It's this very rugged mountain range called the Kokoda Track.
It's up to like 14,000 feet, right? It's
the only
mountains.
Yeah, I mean, these are in some places about 14,000 feet. This is like the Rockies in the West. And it was a place very few people were really familiar with. The Japanese, they had their own intelligence failures, I guess, or their own bravado, whatever it was. They decided they were going to land at Buna and march across the island and take Port Moresby, which was the main port and colonial capital. And they very nearly succeeded in doing that. The Australians had to rush in what forces they had to fight the Japanese along that Kokoda track. And they successfully checked the Japanese. But the MacArthur, who's commanding Allied forces, he needed more troops in New Guinea to, there was great concern that the Japanese were going to reach Port Moresby and therefore be able to menace the Australian coast. So he needed, the Australians are rushing people in there, but he did not have very many American troops either, and the 32nd Division went in to try to stem that tide.
Okay. So, Mark, why don't you kind of tell us a bit more about the fighting? It's pretty gruesome. The conditions that these men are fighting in, and also a little bit more kind of about the Japanese they're facing. So I'm questioning like their environment, their opposition, and kind of how those initial actions play out.
Sure. Well, the first challenge that the 32nd Division had was getting across the Owen Stanley Range in the first place. Again, the Americans didn't have very good intelligence on what those mountains were like either. And so getting forces across the Owen Stanley Range was a difficult thing. The Australians were already on the Kokoda track, and it was a place that the Australians were already fairly familiar with. But what MacArthur wanted to do was have the Americans sort of flank the Japanese on the Kokoda track, and they were looking for a way to get across those mountains. And MacArthur sent a battalion of the 126th Infantry, 32nd Division, over a track through the Owen Stanleys that was called the Kappa. Americans called it the Kappa Kappa track, not knowing quite what to expect. And they came across very high mountains, very rugged mountains, fast-moving rivers and fast-moving streams, trails that were oftentimes very, 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 very narrow over mountain ridges and these sorts of things. And then once they finally crossed over the dividing line, they came across this unusual environment called a cloud forest, which is basically everything was moss. And it was just in a very strange and unusual environment. And to top it all off, probably the major problem was malaria. People understood that there was a malaria problem, but in a situation like this, you couldn't pre-treat the area for malaria. They had quinine, but that didn't work as well as the Attabrin that later came, and the quinine pills would sort of fall apart in the humid tropical environment, and they suffered tremendously from malaria. Just that one battalion going over. Right. So they didn't have the supplies. They had to depend on airdrops, but in the middle of the jungle, it's hard to tell where you're dropping the material. This was really something that was new in the American military experience as well. So they got across the mountains, but were utterly exhausted by it. And that was just one battalion.
This is like, we're not even fighting yet. We're just trying to get to where the fight is.
Get to the battlefield.
Yeah, and it was a remarkably grueling affair. Again, the Americans, like the Japanese, didn't quite understand the environment. Now, one of the firsts that the 32nd Division had during the Second World War was that it was the first division to fly into a combat zone. The Australians had some airfields on the north side of the island, and so American forces were put in aircraft and sent to these airfields on the North Shore So they were the first ones to really fly into the combat zone. Going around the northern shore, by the way, that was a very problematic thing. The shoreline was not very well mapped. There were reefs that were uncharted, and the Navy, which was fighting Guadalcanal, really didn't want to provide MacArthur with very much support. So an amphibious invasion really wasn't part of the MacArthur's planning, because he didn't have the naval support. He would have to go overland, and going overland was extremely difficult. So, and even those soldiers who flew into the area, they still had to march 30 miles or so to even get to Buna in the first place. So you can imagine that also was very taxing on the soldiers themselves. As for Buna itself, it was located on the coast. It was largely a coastal plain, but it's a place that's surrounded by swamplands. There were a few trails that went to the Japanese airfield, and where the Japanese had their forces concentrated. The Japanese had lined those trails with all kinds of bunkers and trenches and these sorts of things that were extremely well camouflaged, and the inexperienced Americans oftentimes didn't see them until it was too late. And I should also note that there were severe intelligence failures as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it was they were grossly underestimated. The Japanese, or MacArthur's staff, I should say, not.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, even those commanders on the ground, they were convinced that the Japanese were beaten by malaria and maybe only had about 2,000 soldiers there, and that turned out not to be the case at all. There were 6,000 soldiers, Japanese soldiers, in 3 pockets around the Buna area, well entrenched, pretty well supplied. Many were battle hardened, whereas American troops were not. They were rookies. Yeah. That was also a contributing factor to the traumatic first combat that the 32nd Division had. Some Australian soldiers were experienced in the Mediterranean. MacArthur and many American commanders tended to discount Australian military prowess, and they probably should not have.
Yeah.
Well, there were some members of the 32nd Division who were combat experienced, because they had fought for the International Brigade in the Spanish Civil War. Yes. And we've talked about people like that, Chris, on the show before, who were in the Spanish Civil War and then were involved in the U.S. Army. You got a couple of people in the 32nd that you write about that fall into that category. Can you tell us about them? And when you do so, do make sure to mention what happened to Robert Thompson after the war. But tell us about those guys.
Okay, and we'll talk about Robert Thompson. Well, I'll talk about, there's 2 people I feature in the book who had fought in Spain in the international brigades and who had communist political affiliations. The first one I'll talk about, as you mentioned, was Robert Thompson. He was from Oregon. And to take a step back a little bit, just before the division went to Australia, they were about 4,000 under strength. And so there were trainees from West Coast training bases that were thrown into the division at the last minute. I mean, they were literally in the division for, I'm sure in some cases, less than a week, and then they got on a boat and they went to Australia to go to war. So when this first big batch of replacements came from West Coast training camps, and so Robert Thompson was one of these who I believe he was at Camp Roberts, California. He wanted to continue his fight against fascism in the U.S. Army, so he enlisted in the U.S. Army. He ended up in the 32nd Division, went to Australia. He won, I believe it was the
Distinguished Service Cross.
Thank you. For leading this river crossing west of Buna, during the conflict. They were on the way towards the Sanandana track. So he won the Distinguished Service Cross for that. And he was very, very enthusiastic about fighting fascism. He wrote this primer to jungle warfare. He published an article in the Infantry Journal about sniping. So he was gung-ho about fighting fascism, but malaria eventually got the best of him, and he was medically sent back to the United States and was medically discharged. As for his post-war career, he maintained his allegiance to communism. He continued to be a communist activist, and in the Cold War, of course, that was not very
That's a no-no.
in post-war America, and he was jailed for his communist activities. He jumped bail, and they recaptured him, and they added more to his sentence. So he served, I think, 3 or 4 years ultimately of his sentence before he was released. And he died of a heart attack in 1965. Maybe it was 66. I'm blanking on the date offhand. And there was a sort of a big controversy about whether or not to bury him at Arlington. The original plan was to bury him at Arlington, and there were people in Congress and the Defense Department later didn't want to bury him. It went into the courts, and eventually the courts ruled that his remains would in fact be at Arlington Cemetery, where I assume his remains are still to this day. The second figure was perhaps the most, during the war years, perhaps the most famous member of the division. And this was a German immigrant named Hermann Bacher. He, as a teenager, got involved in the communist movement in Germany. If you know German history at all, this was not that unusual in the 1920s Germany, the street fighting that went on in Germany after the First World War. So he eventually left Germany. He went to Australia for a while. Then he went to San Francisco, where he lived with an aunt. He had been to Spain as well. And had apparently had quite a reputation for his combat prowess in Spain. He too wanted to continue fighting fascism, so he enlisted right after Pearl Harbor. Again, he was in San Francisco, so he ended up in the 32nd Division just as it was being sent off to Australia. So these were two soldiers who did have combat experience. Bacher gained national headlines for an attack he led at a place called Boona Village. It was it was on sort of the eastern end of the Boona pocket. He led this assault that basically cut off Boona Village from the rest of Japanese positions. This was called Bacher's Corner. He managed to take it. He managed to hold it, and by all accounts, he did this quite bravely. He took a machine gun apparently at one point and machine gunned a Japanese supply ship off the coast, and he managed to hold this position, and the Japanese would eventually be forced to evacuate this place, Boona Village, and this gained him national fame. He was in Life magazine. He was featured in other magazine articles as well. His story was in
He won 2 Distinguished Service Crosses.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was featured in newspapers. He was the one-man army from Boona. As I recall, I could be wrong about this, but I'm thinking offhand, of all the magazine articles and newspaper articles he was featured in, they mentioned that he had fought in Spain. I don't recall that any of them mentioned his communist affiliation well with the the Soviet Union, but it was still a controversial thing. So that wasn't mentioned in many of the other articles. He went on in the division. He would eventually go on to command the reconnaissance troop.
He was promoted from sergeant to captain.
Captain, yes. He commanded the reconnaissance troop in New Guinea, then on Leyte, and he was killed on Lake T in December of 1944. And when he was killed, this led to another wave of newspaper articles across the country. An article about him was in Yank magazine. So he was probably the most famous person in the division during the war years. And again, in the post-war years, knowing what we know now about America's policies towards communism, I think Botcher in particular really got left out of the post-World War II American story of the war, certainly the 32nd Division story of the war. So think what you will of his politics. He fought bravely. His experience was very, very important for helping the division be successful. And I thought he needed to be sort of reintroduced into the narrative of the division and the Pacific in general. It's certainly an interesting story, regardless of your politics.
So Mark, tying into you've been talking about all these news stories and some of the people and their experience. We had a question from Wally Morrison that sort of ties into all this, and Wally wants to know: was there any press that followed the 32nd during their fighting in New Guinea, and how was that? And I would add to that: how were these stories getting out to people?
Yes, there was a fair amount of press that was following the 32nd Division. In fact, again, in the Pacific, the 32nd Division was the first U.S. Army division to go in. So there were from the major newspapers. There was a reporter from the Milwaukee Journal. His name was Robert Doyle, whose papers and photographs were very important for my writing of this book. In fact, there was a photographer named George Strock who went with them as well and shot a very famous photograph of 3 dead American soldiers on the beach at Buna. There was a lot of debate among high officials in America about just how graphic of photographs we should show the American public. Obviously, it's very disturbing to see dead Americans. But President Roosevelt, among others, was concerned that the American public was getting too sanitized a view of the war and didn't fully appreciate, and might not fully appreciate the sacrifices that GIs were making. So this photograph of 3 dead Americans by George Strock at Buna, it was published in Life magazine, I think September of 1943. And it created a bit of a national sensation. It was the first time that dead Americans were portrayed in newspapers, at least in such a graphic fashion. Graphic is relative when you understand what happens in a war. The photograph wasn't particularly gory. No faces are being shown. The bodies were intact. But for the context of the time, it unleashed a debate among Americans about the appropriateness of showing such images. So those are some examples of some of the press that followed the division at Buna. And throughout the war, Doyle stayed with the division until sometime in 1944. There were other reporters who followed. In 1945, there's a journalist for the Detroit News named John Carlisle. He collected some of the stories in a book called Red Arrow Men, which is the story of the Red Arrow Division in the Philippines on the Villa Verde Trail. So there were reporters with them, and yet. One of the things I say in the book is that the 32nd Division oftentimes did not get very much public attention at the same time. They seem to always be overshadowed, for whatever reason, overshadowed by some other thing going on. As the 32nd Division is fighting at Buna, the Battle of Guadalcanal is going on,
Right.
which was bigger. And some argue the Marines are much better at public relations than the Army.
Yes.
While they're fighting on the Villa Verde Trail in the Philippines.
Well, let's talk about that. So that first of all, it's worth mentioning. I mean, we can't get into everything the 32nd Division did because they're in combat essentially for 3 years, not every day for 3 years, but over a period of 3 years, they're in combat on and off. They're fighting in Buna. They come back to Australia. They come back to New Guinea. They do more things in New Guinea. Eventually, they are going to be fighting in the Philippines, and then eventually. They are going to be at the same time that famous battles are being fought in Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The 32nd is fighting a battle at a now largely forgotten place called the Villa Verde Trail, which may be smaller than some of the battles that are going on that are more famous, but it is many ways matches the horror of those other battles. And you call this the most difficult phase of their Pacific experience. So what's going on here? And I can start with the map, and we've got some photos so we can illustrate this a little bit.
Sure. And that's after the Buna experience. What I mean by that is that the 32nd Division, they fought 2 pretty tough battles back to back. Another battle that's oftentimes overshadowed is the battle on the island of Leyte. When we think about Leyte, it's the naval battle, which obviously was very important, perhaps the greatest naval battle in the history of warfare. I don't want to discount that, obviously. But while that's going on, and for a longer period, there's a land battle that's going on that island. The Japanese wanted to make their big stand on Leyte, hoping that they could, crush American forces and crush America's will to continue. And the 32nd Division was sent in about a month after that battle had begun. So they're fighting mostly north of Ormoc. It was Route 2, you can see on the map here. And that was a pretty grueling battle. They had about 3 weeks rest, and then they were dispatched to Luzon. Luzon had been invaded. It was January of 1945. And then the 32nd Division was sent in a couple of weeks after that initial invasion, and then was sent into the mountains of northern Luzon to pursue Yamashita. So what I meant by that was you had these 2 really tough battles back to back. And on the Villa Verde Trail, just to be clear, this was most of this trail was not much more than a footpath. It was created in the 1880s by a Spanish priest who wanted to spread the gospel to the peoples of the northern Philippines. It was not a big enough roadway to really support a major combat operation. So as the infantry went forward, they were followed very closely by engineers who had to basically carve this foot trail into a roadway that was capable of truck and tank traffic. And then this is in the mountains of the northern Philippines, and the Japanese had time to prepare this and had these interlocking bunkers and self-supporting bunkers. And it was, people are familiar with the Battle of Okinawa. It was much the same thing. Every one of these bunkers had to be rooted out one by one. And it was exceptionally bloody business.
So Mark, picking up on that, and this is also kind of looking at Buna and then carrying that into the Philippines. I want to talk about casualties because, I just looking at the New Guinea campaign, I'm quoting Stanley Frank here, and he said, the Papuan campaign was one of the costliest Allied victories of the Pacific War in terms of troops committed. The 32nd committed 9,825 men to combat in New Guinea. It suffered 2,500 battle casualties and a further 7,125 casualties due to illness brought on by the conditions in which they're fighting. Mm-hmm. That's over 100% casualties. So how is that division sustaining itself, continuing to prove and act effectively? And are there casualties similar, Lady and Luzon? Is this, what the experience is?
Yeah. Buna was a bit different in that so many of the casualties were malaria. Again, the U.S. military and that's not to take away from the really hard battle deaths and psychological casualties and these sorts of things. But what really led to, I use figures from Samuel Milner's book in the Green Book series. That's how you get 90% casualties. Yeah. It's just the malaria that really hit that division really, really hard. Soldiers were kept in combat even with fevers well over 100 degrees. And when you read the accounts of the battle, many soldiers write of fellow soldiers who died of fever while they're in a foxhole facing the Japanese. And when it came to malaria, even those behind the lines were greatly affected by it. So if you're a supply sergeant in Port Moresby or at Milne Bay, which was a major supply base for the Red Arrow, you got malaria there as well. Now, by the later campaigns, let's say the Villa Verde Trail, the fighting was every bit as brutal, maybe even harsher. But by that time, the U.S. military had Adabrin. It was a better prophylactic drug against malaria. The Army had a better idea of how to treat areas for malaria, spraying swamps and these sorts of things. And on the Villa Verde Trail, it's in the mountains, so it's not as much of an issue. So those exceptionally high casualties at Buna, a lot of that is the malaria is what really put that over the top, which was significant, but less of an issue as the war went on. Combat-wise, I don't know how you judge how one battle is worse than another, but probably on equal terms. But it was the malaria and the disease issue. I should mention also dengue fever. GIs talked about what they call jungle rot, various kinds of fungal infections that they got, dysentery and these sorts of things from rotten food, spoiled rations, drinking untreated water, these sorts of things. The disease is what really put Buna over the top. And those are some of the lessons that the U.S. military learned in those later campaigns.
Well, speaking of lessons learned, the 32nd is in action, as I said, over a period of 3 years, from the fall of 1942 to the fall of 1945. Obviously, there are huge personnel changes at that time. There's very few people, although there are some who are in action from beginning to the end. But there's also a great upheaval in tactics, training, equipment over that period. I mean, the army that launches this unit into war in 1942 is very different from the one fighting 3 years later, isn't it?
It is. It absolutely is. Just to give you a sense of how unprepared the 32nd Division was when it went into Buna, they didn't have camouflage fatigues. So just before they head up to Australia, they send their uniforms off to a cleaner. I can't think of the word I'm trying to think of. A shop in Brisbane to have them dyed green. Just to give you a sense of how unprepared they were when they went into Buna. Plus transporting supplies and people and things like this to the Pacific early in the war. American war production is just getting ramped up. The U.S. military doesn't really have the infrastructure. They don't have a system for replacements. There were very few replacements that went into Buna. They sort of combed through supply depots and things like this in Australia and just sort of shoved people in the front lines. But even then, no more than a few hundred replacements really came in. Whereas in the Philippines, they had the Repel depots behind the lines. They had shipping to be able to bring supplies and replacements to very remote parts of the world like New Guinea. And of course, the Army learned, the U.S. military, I should say, in general, learned the lessons of those initial battles. They understood jungle warfare, understood the Japanese, developed better weapons as the war goes on. And the personnel, as you noted, changed quite a bit as well. Again, it was not the National Guard division that it was when they went to Buna. By the time they were in the Philippines, this was a fully nationalized division, as well trained as could be in the Pacific.
So, Mark,
give us a last question, Chris.
Yeah, I guess obviously people in Wisconsin and Michigan are very happy and relieved that you wrote this book. But why is it that people that maybe don't have that connection geographically to this unit, and what is it about their story that you think should be picked? And I should, as an aside, you should read the book because there's so much here. But why should somebody from Connecticut read the book?
Oh, well, that's a really good question, actually. I don't know how I respond to that. I guess I would say is that the 32nd Division, if you want a lot of the popular culture books and movies and these sorts of things, Band of Brothers was a group of paratroopers. The other series, the Pacific, they're Marines. We tend to focus on the really elite units. The 32nd Division was not that. It was a bunch of ordinary people, beginning with ordinary National Guard troops from Wisconsin and Michigan. As the war progresses, it's full of a lot of ordinary guys from all across the country, but it wasn't elite. It wasn't, didn't have special equipment or anything like this. It was extraordinarily ordinary. Maybe I'm overstating the case there, but I think that's why. It's the everyday person. I think the 32nd Division represents them.
Well, I'll add to that. I'll answer that question too, Chris, because I did really enjoy this book. It's the first U.S. Army division to go into action in the Pacific. It's one of the last divisions to be fighting against the Japanese 3 years later. It's got numerous Medal of Honor winners, but it goes through terrible, terrible times as well. Everything in the book, from the fighting to the dealing with the bordellos to the connection with Rock Around the Clock.
Well, and you have to pick up the book if for no other reason than this. I had never ever heard of this. Dutch Code Talkers.
There you go. Right. Dutch
Buy
Code
the book
Talkers.
and find that's.
So, it was fairly spontaneance.
So there's lots of reasons to read this book, guys. We so appreciate that we've had on today Mark Van Ells, and he is the author of Red Arrow Across the Pacific, the 32nd Infantry Division during World War II. Mark, thank you, because I did not know anything about the 32nd Division story, and now I do. And there's some great people, great commanders, great officers. There's a million stories in there. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you once again for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay.
Good luck with it.
Thanks.
And Chris, next week, complete change of direction.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which we'll want to do.
As is a history happy hour motif.
Ooh.
Is it a motif? Cool. Can we have a motif? Something like that. But we're going to be talking to Richard Parker, who's the author of The Crossing, El Paso, the Southwest, and America's Forgotten Origin Story. I thought we began with the Pilgrims at Plymouth.
Oh, I guess you're going to have to.
But apparently there's another way to look at it. And so we're going to have
it's an awfully big country, and so I guess people can come from different directions. And if you
speak Spanish, maybe you were here 100, 150 years before the Pilgrims. Well,
so they were
with
like lawn chairs waiting for the Pilgrims to show up, saying, "Hey, where you been?"
They were like sipping beer and just waiting for those Anglos to come from Northern Europe.
Okay.
All right. Well, that's next week. And you'll be you'll be
I don't know. I think I'm going to be. I might even.
Hawaii, I'm
I
told.
think I'll be in Hawaii, but I might
I'm
still
fearful
be
I'm
in
going to have to do
Japan.
this show by myself, but we'll see how it goes.
Well, or you'll see me with a lei and a drink with an umbrella in it. So that would.
I'm looking forward to that.
There you go.
I'd like to see you tanned. That would be that's a dream come true.
Or a nightmare.
Yeah, maybe. Guys, please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.